So, welcome to the latest episode of the MoneyWise UK podcast. I'm George, your host, and I'm delighted to be joined once again by Richard Parkin, who's head of retirement at BNY Investments. Richard was my guest on a previous episode where we had a fascinating discussion about the FCA's thematic review of retirement advice. Now, lots have changed in the last few months since we last spoke, and Richard has recently published an interesting research document on retirement advice in the UK, conducted in conjunction with Next Wealth. I wanted to revisit some of our previous discussions and explore the findings from his latest work. So welcome, Richard.
Hi, George. Good to be here.
Hi. Yeah. For any listeners who may have missed our previous conversation, can you just give some background on yourself? What led you to a career in retirement industry, and how did you become involved in the latest research?
Yes, sure. So I've been in the industry an awfully long time. I started in the early 1990s as originally as an actuarial trainee, but I very quickly diverted away from that and got into defined contribution, pensions and investment. DC was really just starting to take off in the UK. So a lot of my time was spent looking at sort of designing DC plans, and I actually spent 15 years at Fidelity helping them build the DC platform. But in 2013, Fidelity asked me if I wanted to be head of retirement for the UK, which sounded like quite a boring job, but I went ahead and took it anyway. And then 6 months later, George Osborne announced pension freedom, and it suddenly became the most sort of exciting part of the industry, and that I've been focused on retirement ever since. So I joined BNY a couple of years ago, having done a bit of consulting work for them, and really they were looking to help understand how they could support advisors better with retirement advice. They recognised retirement was a big area of focus for advisors, but also it was a really quite challenging area, as I'm sure we're going to touch on in this discussion. And so my role as head of retirement is to spend time talking to advisors, understanding their challenges, helping bring some of the resources that BNY Investments has to bear in answering those. But a lot of it involves sort of commissioning research and sharing best practice. I mean, I'd like to think that advisors like to hear what I say, but what I know they love to hear is how their peers are getting on. And so this research report called Retirement Advice in the UK, Time for Change, was really trying to kind of shine a light on how advisors have been developing their retirement advice propositions. And this bit of research is actually really close to my heart, because I started this report with Heather Hopkins, who's CEO at Next Wealth, back in 2018. So I actually called her up to see if she fancied a cup of coffee. She just set Next Wealth up. I just set up my own consultancy. So asked her for a coffee to see how things were going. And she said, "Well, you fancy writing reports?" We did. And it's become a regular thing. So I worked on that with Heather and the team right up until the time that I joined BNY, produced it every year. And I'm, Aegon very kindly sponsored the report for many years, and we've now taken over that sponsorship. So it's really like, sort of coming home for me. And actually the fact that it's been running for 7 years gives us some really good insight into how things have changed over time. So we've surveyed 208 advisors, not quite sure why it was 208, we're targeting 200, we've got a few extra. So we did a quantitative survey with them, but we also, through Next Wealth, went out and did in-depth interviews with 10 firms. We actually did 5, though we did the quant research in around October time, but we did the interviews with advisors, did 5 before the budget and then 5 afterwards. So we picked up what the sort of impact of some of those big changes in the budget were. And then just the final bit on this year's research. So we've done this once before, but this year we wanted to hear from customers as well, from clients. So we did a survey of 200 advised clients with more than £100,000 of investable assets. And we kind of split those right down the middle. Half of them were aged between 55 and 64, and the other were 65 and over. So we got a good contrast of how those different groups felt about retirement advice.
And I think it's interesting to know kind of how far it goes back, and also the fact that it's had clients' input as well. And I think the 3 bits that I picked up were 47% of advisors feel compliance with the thematic review negatively impacts their ability to meet client demand. 28% of advisors have no plans to introduce a common, consistent model for retirement advice. And 40% of advisors have no plans to use a different set of portfolios for decumulation from those they use in accumulation. So think when I saw those, that's what really drove me into this conversation. So I'd like to really sort of pack those areas with you. So if we take the first one, so compliance and client demand, the report highlights this 47% of advisors feel that compliance with the FCA's review negatively impacts their ability to meet demand. So I think what I'd like to kind of get to is what your take is on this. I know in our previous conversation, we discussed how retirement planning is complex. You talked about it being intellectually rewarding, and in many ways, the review clarifies existing practices rather than entirely new regulations. So, I guess with this in mind, what are your sort of thoughts on the challenges that advisors face?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the really positive thing is there's a huge demand for retirement advice. Our respondents told us that just under 60% of the assets they look after relate to clients who are approaching at or in retirement. So, at that point where they're really starting to think about taking benefits, and demand is only set to grow, particularly with what happened in the budget and what we've seen in terms of market and economic conditions. But you're right that we also said, well, what's getting in the way of that demand, and compliance with the review and actually regulation in general was pointed as something which kind of stops them or limits their ability to meet that demand. Now, I don't think I've ever done a piece of research where regulation doesn't come out as a biggest challenge for advisors. So what's in that? I think first of all, you're right. The review itself, it didn't find lots of bad practice, but certainly a lot of work-ons for advisors to take a look at. So just kind of going through the process of making sure that they're meeting the regulator's expectations of itself takes time. There were a couple of areas, though, where you can imagine the work involved may get more onerous. So a big area of the review was around record keeping. So the regulator sent out quite a long questionnaire, about 87 questions, to kick the review off, and didn't get answers from many of the firms it sent it to, and those that it did get were incomplete. So the regulator said, well, here's the part of the review was, here's the questionnaire, make sure next time we send it to you, you can answer it. So I know a lot of firms have been looking at their record keeping, 20% of firms, so they had to make big changes to their record keeping, with about just under 40% saying that they were going to have to make some more minor changes. So I think just the documenting what you're doing, as always, for advisors, I think takes a bit of extra time. Within the review findings, the FCA published what I think is quite a helpful tool, the Retirement Income Advice Assessment Tool, which is a spreadsheet similar to the DB Advice Assessment Tool, which is what the file checkers from the FCA use when they're looking at files. I think some firms are trying to grapple with that and say, right, how do we kind of do more in terms of file checking? And then just in terms of giving the advice itself, one of the things the FCA has pointed to, it hasn't mandated, it's important to say they haven't mandated it, but they're very clear, they're very keen on cash flow planning. And while we found that cash flow planning is widely used by advisors, I think probably nearly over 85% of firms said that they have cash flow planning or are planning to use it. What we found is they don't always go into detailed cash flow plans for every client. They might tend to do it for clients who've got defined benefit transfers, or where the level of income is relatively high compared to the client's assets. But for many, where clients income requirements are quite modest relative to their assets, you probably don't need to do a full plan. But I think the expectation is almost that every client will have a reasonably detailed cash flow plan. So if that's the case, firms will be having to do more. And it's worth just finishing off on this to say that in my discussions with advisors over the past 10 years, productivity has always been a big limit on what advisors can do in this space. There is no shortage of demand for many firms. It's just being able to get through doing the annual reviews. And so there's a really interesting point about how technology and improving business practices can help clients shorten some of the time taken to give advice, so that they can therefore meet more of that demand. We're seeing some really interesting developments in terms of tools to support particularly that annual review process.
And I think, I guess that's the thing, is that we often forget that financial planners are running a business. I know that when I was talking to a financial planner And it's not just going out and meeting the clients or doing the annual reviews, it's everything that comes with it. So I think that's quite interesting what you were saying there is that challenge.
And one of the things the FCA has been saying in the review, and actually we had the benefit of interviewing them for a roadshow we did with Next Wealth on the research, is obviously suitability of advice is important, but they were very keen to emphasise the importance of clients understanding that advice, and I think they see cash flow planning as a good way of doing that. I'm not sure I totally agree, because I think a lot of you and I like looking at charts all day, George, don't we? But a lot of people see a chart and they get turned off. So I'm not sure cash flow planning is necessarily the great sort of enlightening tool that the regulator thinks it is. But it's important, and again, firms will need to spend more time not just giving the advice, but demonstrating that the client has actually understood the advice that's been given.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because that cash flow modeling is an assumption that the client will understand it. Maybe some do, but I guess all they want to know fundamentally is, are they okay? So I do question, I understand why you need it to get to the report, but whether you need to show it to the client or all of it, it's probably another debate. I think one of the things that, in fact, it's relative. It seems quite low actually. This, but 28% of advisors have no plans to introduce a common, consistent model for retirement advice. And obviously, we just talked about cash flow modeling, which is one of the things that the FCA talk about in terms of consistency. So, in our earlier discussion, I remember I was listening to it. You talked about the need for this sort of structured approach. Does the response or the numbers, are you concerned by that? Do you think that some financial planners might be underestimating the opportunities within this, or kind of the risks that are involved by just carrying on as they're doing?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. So that original report Heather and I wrote back in 2018. This was one of the questions we were trying to answer. I mean, the two big questions at the time was: is this DB transfer trend going to carry on forever? And is everybody going to start following these centralised retirement propositions, which I think is used, although sometimes that term is misunderstood. Hence, we ask firms whether they have a common and consistent approach to retirement planning, because for us, the CRP isn't just about, are you using a different set of portfolios? It's about, are you using a process across the firm which looks at how you assess risk, which portfolios you use, but how you set withdrawal rates, how you decide when to use guaranteed income, and so on. And when we did that report back in 2018, we found that only about 40% of firms said that they had a CRP. And actually, when we asked the question this year, it turns out only 38% said they'd had a CRP in place for more than 12 months. But you're right, a big chunk of them, so about 34% said no, either we put one in the past 12 months or intending to do so in the next 12 months. And when we said, well, why are you doing that? The main driver was the regulator expected it. And indeed, again, they don't mandate CRPs, but they talk about the benefits of having this consistent approach. And it's important to recognise that, of course, the regulator wants to see suitability, but it's not about getting everything right all the time, but it's about being consistent. They want to know that if I walk into your firm and see advisor A, I'm going to get more or less the kind of same advice if I walked in and saw advisor B, or that advisor A is going to give the same advice to, or similar advice to, two clients in the same position. So there's 28% says that no, we don't need this common and consistent approach. But when we asked them why they didn't need it, they said that 84% of them said, well, we prefer to tailor advice to client needs. And that's exactly right. That's exactly what the regulator wants. Elsewhere, they talk about, particularly around withdrawal strategy. They want to make sure that the withdrawal strategy is set with reference to client needs. So that's not a contradiction, but it's this consistency point. So it's about how you deliver that tailored advice, but in a consistent fashion. And you and I have talked offline, George, haven't we, about how difficult it is to build one of these CRPs, because you're trying to build a document that is, or a process that is sufficiently flexible to take into account all those different client needs, but at the same time is sufficiently directive so that, two advisors will give more of the same advice. So it is really challenging. We see a lot of firms grappling with it. I know you spend a lot of your time talking to firms about this as well. So I think more work to be done there. But so no, I'm not worried about it because I don't think it's because people are going rogue. It's just about they're probably doing it anyway. They probably just don't call it a CRP, right? And particularly with smaller firms, they will give the advice the way they give advice. So that's another good reason.
Yeah, I think that's quite nice to hear because I think that's the thing is that we label it with a name. I mean, I guess you do want an element of guardrails, whatever you want to call it, within the business. But equally, if you look at good and bad practice, what the FCA they want that flexibility, don't they? So that there is that kind of contradiction of having guardrails, but also the flexibility to adapt to a client's needs, isn't it? So
Yeah,
um,
and one of the things I really like, the guys at Verve, and I don't know if they nicked this term from somebody else, but they talk as CRP as being a centralized retirement philosophy rather
okay.
than a proposition. I think it's very easy to imagine you've got to kind of write down every single possible case that could occur and then how you deal with it. But I think if you can establish some clear principles about how you do cash flow modeling, probably have some central control around things like that, clear philosophy of when you use guaranteed income. I think that takes you a long way to being able to cope with that variability rather than getting into, trying to come up with 1,000 different use cases you have for retirement.
Yeah. I think maybe we've talked about this a little bit because I know in my previous firm that we never changed the client's portfolio that they were in once they went into retirement. And the argument was, well, you've got 20 or 30 years in retirement, so why would you change it? But I think when we discussed it, you talked about the kind of risk management and how that changes once you go into retirement. So it would be interesting to kind of get your thoughts around that, whether you again, is that something we should be worried about? Is that advisors are just using the same funds, and yeah, perhaps just unpack that a little bit further and what the implications might be by carrying on the way that they've done it in the
Yeah,
past.
sure. So I think it's important to note that the review doesn't say you have to use different funds. Yeah. I have heard people from the FCA suggest that is the expectation. But what the review actually says is the FCA recognises that the risks facing retirement clients are different, and in particular talks about this idea of thinking about capacity for loss in terms of the ability of the client to withstand changes to their income level, either because they've suffered a capital loss and therefore the income is less sustainable in the future, but also if they bought an annuity, maybe a level annuity, and inflation takes off and undermines the purchasing power of that. So it's not just about capital loss. And indeed, I spend a lot of my time talking to clients about the fact that it's capital loss and income sustainability aren't completely, they're not 100% correlated. For example, if you have a natural income strategy, you can have quite big variations in capital, but your income may end up being relatively stable. I think the important thing for advisors is to make sure, what the FCA says is you've got to make sure that your products and the services, the advice you give is specifically suitable for the risks that your clients face. So you can kind of apply a logic which says, right, well, the FCA is saying the risks are different and you have to make sure your products are suitable for the risks and therefore you need different products. And we do see more and more clients starting to look at this, more and more advisors. So we find that the total return approach, where you run a portfolio and just sell shares to generate income, remains the most popular. But when we asked firms how they intend to develop that over the next few years, we saw a slight reduction in that approach and actually more people looking at things like natural income, but also looking at this bucket approach where you divide the client's assets between short, medium and long-term investments to meet short, medium and long-term income needs. So yeah, it's horses for courses, but what it comes back to is advisors need to be able to demonstrate that whatever they're doing meets the specific risks that retirement income clients are facing.
And it's interesting that we talk about that. Is that and certainly the people I speak to are always said that there's no one set route that is right. It's ensuring that sustainability, which kind of falls onto this kind of pension freedom and annuities. And I know that we touched on pension freedom and annuity in the last discussion, but then the budget happened, and so we've had the budget. We've got this paper. Do you think that, assuming what they've said in the budget comes in 2027, I think it is,
Yeah.
do you think that this changes anything? And could we see a renewed interest in annuities as a result of it? Or do you think the change in annuities was coming anyway because of what was happening?
Yeah, I think, well, it certainly was, and we have seen an uptick in the use of annuities. A lot of the sort of growth in annuity sales. If you talk to some of the annuity providers, a lot of that was coming from direct purchases. You know, a lot of people coming out of DC schemes, but we have seen advisors start to take more interest. And actually, the work that we did, the research that we did, suggested that I think about 30% of firms said they expected to increase the use over the next 3 years of lifetime annuities, slightly less in terms of fixed term annuities. But yeah, this idea of blending guaranteed income and investments was one that was certainly taking hold. And it has actually always been where the FCA would like things to go. I remember talking to some people from the FCA probably about 10 years ago now, just after pension freedom had come in, when they were doing the retirement outcomes review. And they was complaining about lack of product innovation. And I said, well, what do you mean lack of product innovation? I said, well, this products that can blend guaranteed income and investments. They always thought that was the right way to go. And I think, we think for many clients, that's the right way to go. Now, that might not be annuities for a lot of the current generation of retirees. They'll have defined benefit. They'll have higher state pensions, giving them plenty of guaranteed income. But being able to use annuities either to generate lifetime guaranteed income or just provide a bit of sort of short-term support in terms of for temporary annuities, that trend was definitely happening. Turning then to this question about does the inheritance tax treatment of pensions drive greater annuity use? Well, first of all, I don't think we can underestimate how big a change this is. Just a couple more stats from the report. So, as I mentioned earlier, we did this research just before the budget, and we said to firms, which of these things, how big an impact would this have on your firms? We gave them a long list. I mean, there's a huge list of things that people thought the Chancellor might do, and we said, changes the inheritance tax treatment of pensions on death. So we had 61% of firms said it affects all or most of their clients. So, we all know it's a big area of focus for advised clients, the ability to pass this on. We also asked whether they were, followed this approach where you leave the pension till last in terms of drawing down income, and 72% of them said they did. So on the one hand, you've got, it affects most of my clients, and actually I'm currently running an advice approach where my approach has been to leave the pension till last for inheritance tax reasons. That's all been turned on its head. So clearly the change is not welcome in terms of, more tax is never welcome, but it does create huge planning opportunities for advisors in terms of being able to help clients. You don't need to have a very big pension fund on top of a house in order to start running into challenges here. Whether it means, it's very easy to think, George, isn't it, that what clients will do is give away all their money and buy an annuity. But I think there's a few bits in that which means I'm not sure that will necessarily be the case. One is that it can be quite difficult to get the money out of the pension to gift it without triggering higher tax, right? So how do you do that? And in any case, I think some of the treatment of annuities on death is still, there's a bit of a question mark over that. And some of the advisors I talked to take the view of, it's better to have 60% of something than 100% of nothing, right? So, being able to predict what your income needs are, even in later life, can be quite challenging. So giving away your assets and potentially taking away the ability to deal with unforeseen circumstances, maybe cost of long-term care, is potentially a risky strategy. So I don't think, I suspect we'll see annuities come in as one of the planning tools there, but I don't think it's going to be a wholesale kind of switch out at this stage. I think it actually puts even more emphasis back on the investment proposition to drive some growth out of that, stay invested in assets that can generate that long-term growth, so that if you do have to pay the tax, you're taking the tax on a bigger pot.
And it's interesting. I think coming from that is like, pension freedoms and obviously the budget, is that it shows that landscape that is changing and how complicated it is. And and I think you're right, is that in terms of annuities, is that they're part of the toolbox that we've got there. And I think just kind of shifting a little bit, I just wanted to talk to you about this kind of debate around the importance of annual reviews. And I guess I'm not. I was trying to write this question, but not make it a loaded question. But it may well come across as that. Is that kind of, in your view? Do you think individuals can successfully manage their retirement without professional advice? And I guess that depending where you go down, is that what do financial planners bring to the table that adds value in that space?
Yeah, yeah. I'm pretty clear on this. It's not a loaded question at all, because I'm pretty clear that most people can't manage without professional advice. It's one of the things that I try and emphasize when I'm talking to the regulators, or writing articles, or anything. We've got to get past this idea that you know financial advice is just making people's decision making a little bit better, right? If you look at the stats that come out around from the FCA around what people are doing with their retirement pots, it's very clear people are making some bad mistakes. They're generally cashing out quite early. They're paying a lot of tax. I mean, we're into the billions and billions of pounds of additional tax that have been raised from pension freedom. They'll buy high and sell low. Left to their own devices, people make very poor decisions. So I can understand that the regulator wants to push up the quality and standard of advice, but we've got to recognise that there's a far bigger problem going on where people don't have advice. Now, there are some things going on to change that. The targeted support proposals under the advice guidance boundary review, I think, are a real game changer for those people who either can't afford or don't want to accept advice. I don't think they replace financial planning at all, but they will try and sort of help fewer people make these really dumb mistakes. But interestingly, this thing we were just talking about with inheritance tax, that's going to bring in a whole new group of people in to really being able to really get real value from just the tax planning elements of financial advice. But what I think the financial planner brings is kind of clues in the name, right? They bring the abilities to create a plan, and it's interesting that, I mean, the consumers we spoke to that talk to that bit, they do still focus on investment performance as important, but the real value for me in retirement planning is to build a plan, stress test it under what happens, but to have that advisor alongside you as the world unfolds. Who could have guessed just 3 years ago where we would be today? And the benefit of retirement planning is not just having that initial advice, but having a guide who can be by your side throughout retirement, helping you tackle market falls, changes in personal circumstances, and really, it's not just about picking the best funds. It's about being able to guide people through their retirement, whatever is thrown at them.
And I think that's that. I was trying to describe to someone what the annual review was about, and I was sort of saying it's one element of what someone is paying for in their annual fee. And I sort of said, it's the only way I could describe it was if you had a car and you paid for a service, and that service cost you £1,000 a year, and you took it in, they looked at it, they said, yeah, it's absolutely fine. And then one year the red light comes on and you phone up the garage, they take it in and they sort it. And I think that's kind of where financial planners come in, isn't it? Is that you've always got someone there. And I think you're right, is that the focus in the past has probably been around about investments, but it's much more than that now, isn't it? It's just, and it's how you
changes in people's circumstances. I was talking to an advisor a couple of weeks ago who's making the point that actually changes in people's circumstances, can have a far bigger impact on their retirement plans than whether they get a 4% return or an 8% return this year. People, partner might die early, and inheritance might turn up. Well, let's be positive, but maybe inheritance turns up. I don't know, is that positive? Turns up earlier than expected. But you understand my point. That's the thing, and that's the so ongoing reviews. We actually found consumers saying they generally got the reviews that they wanted. but checking in and making sure it's a suitability review. That's the bit we need to remember. So checking that the advice is still relevant given the client's circumstances is as important as having the review itself. And as I mentioned earlier, when we asked firms what they're looking at, we did see some firms saying, yeah, we are going to take a look at the content and the format of the annual review and just make sure it's really kind of hitting the mark.
And in terms of kind of industry trends, best practices, given the growing focus on retirement planning, I think you said over 60% of clients are for advisors are in retirement. How have you seen this kind of shift take place within the industry? And do you believe that there's a need for more attention in this space? And yeah, I mean, I kind of personally, I'm not sure that there's that kind of cohesive drive within the industry. And I may be wrong. I may be just looking at the wrong side, but I feel that it's still not taken as seriously as it should be. So it'd be just interesting to kind of get your perspective on that and perhaps share examples of where individuals or organizations are working together to amplify the importance of retirement and the messaging around that.
Yeah. So I think it has changed actually, George. You're right. I think post pension freedom, not much change. People carried on doing the same things because they could, because the markets were really supportive, and generally clients, for a lot of the people who retired, they had plenty of defined benefit and the higher state pensions. But now, combination of things. I think 2022 was a real kind of wake up call for clients and some advisors. We saw very challenging times in terms of cost of living increases, and that's affected even those who are relatively wealthy. And then with what markets did in 2022, that sort of bonds and equities both falling. It's only happened about 3 times in the past 150 years, and has never happened on that scale that we saw in 2022. So I think that made people wake up and think, right, maybe we do need to think differently about that. And of course, you had the regulation on top. But as I look around the industry, I mean, this was, when BMY asked me back in 2020, how they should kind of proceed in putting more focus on retirement. I said, you need to get out there and start talking about some of the challenges of retirement investment and why it's different and so on. And I'm actually really delighted to see that other asset managers are now coming and doing that as well. And there's a sort of group of us. I'm not going to give them all free advertising and tell you who they are, but I'm sure your listeners will know who they are, who are all starting to talk more about retirement income and how you think differently about that. The risk profilers are all developing or have developed tools to help advisors use, model how retirement income might work in practice. I know that they had quite a slow start in terms of getting advisors to use those tools, but I think they're getting a lot more interest. And then we're seeing some really, interesting developments from asset management, also other product providers. The sort of comment, this particularly around this idea of blending. We're seeing some annuity products or annuity-like products that can be blended with investments, not just provide guaranteed income, but to actually give you a bit more flexibility on the investment side, knowing that your sort of base level of income is covered. So yeah, I think there is a groundswell. Advisors are really busy, right? I talked to them, they haven't all read the review inside out and implemented it all, but they are focusing on it more and more. We always, whenever we're out talking about retirement, we always get good attendance. So I think it is changing, but it's hard, right? It's the most common, as Will Sharp said, it's the nastiest, hardest problem in finance, right? And he said that, crikey, how many years ago, and it hasn't got any easier. You look across the water at the US, and they're still trying to grapple with it, and they've been trying to solve this problem for a lot longer than we have. So yeah, makes it a very fascinating part of the market to be working in. But I think we're definitely moving forward, and the research shows that.
Yeah, and I think that's really good that people are kind of working together, because ultimately, we've moved from having that guaranteed pension. If everyone had the old defined benefit schemes, in theory, everything would be fine. So, kind of looking at the survey results, was there anything that particularly surprised you, and if so, why?
Yeah. So there's one number that did surprise me. So when we asked firms about when they do a detailed cash flow plan, this is a really nerdy one. But if any of your listeners have got an answer to this, I'd love to hear it. When we asked them when they did a detailed cash flow plan, most advisors said that the time they always use it is when they've done a DB transfer. But that was also the time, the most popular one for advisors saying they never use a detailed plan. So 22% of advisors say they never use a detailed cash flow plan when they're doing DB transfer advice. And yeah, as I said, I'd love to know how you do that, because I think the regulator has been pretty clear they need that. So that was across a number of firms. So I'm obviously missing something there, but I'd love to know what it is. Beyond that, though, perhaps more seriously, although I wasn't surprised by this, I think it was really great to see that consumer research in there. The results were really reassuring in terms of what clients were getting from advice, and the stat that I really liked the most out of that was that 93% of clients said that they were on track for the retirement that they expected, and actually was or better than that. So 7% said no, it's worse than I expected. I think that's the reality. Sometimes people, when they get advice, maybe not like to hear the answer, but 93% said they were on track or better. A quarter of them said retirement's better than I expected. And I hear this story so often of people thinking they're working hard, they think they're never going to be able to retire. They sit down with a financial advisor and they realise that actually they've got more than enough money to start enjoying, maybe not opting out of work altogether, but to start changing their lifestyle. And I love hearing that story, because that is the evidence that it makes. So there's lots in there. I'd encourage your listeners to have a look at the research and give themselves a big pat on the back. Of course, there's work to be done in certain areas, but yeah, really positive feedback from clients.
I like that. I like retirement is better than expected. It reminds me of a client in my previous firm that was terrified about retirement, and then we worked out he could probably quite comfortably afford double what he needed. So yeah. So,
yeah, and just because you've got loads of money doesn't make you any less worried about it. This was something that came through quite clearly. You've got lots more money, but you probably spend twice as much, right? So
yeah. I guess if you've got more money, maybe you worry that you're going to run out. It's almost like
you don't know
why
you. Yeah, right, George. Yeah.
So, kind of the final question. We may have this discussion in a few months' time. Maybe something else will have changed, but the future of retirement advice is kind of how I label this sort of final question. But if we were to look, say, 10 years ahead, where do you think the UK retirement market will be, and what trends or developments do you foresee?
Yeah, so I think the obvious place to start with that is what are retired clients going to want, and this year is the first year that Gen X turned 60. Yeah, so Gen X starts in 1965. And if you look at the stats, so one of the things that I think I mentioned, that the consumer research was split between those under 65 and those over. And you see within that a very different picture of the reliance on different sources of income. So the younger potential retirees, as most of them will be, obviously much less reliant on state and defined benefit, much more reliance on personal pensions and DC. So just that, the reality is the people who are retiring over the next 10 years will be more reliant on their invested assets than today's retirees are. And I think that makes it even more important to get that advice right and get that investment right as well. So that's kind of the context. What will the market look like? I mean, I do hope that I think certainly retirement advice will have grown. I do think that will be enabled a lot by technology in terms of, you can't possibly get through a podcast without saying AI, but I think there's a lot of tools like that can help increase advisor productivity. I think there'll never be a replacement for face-to-face advice. Even younger people want to see a person and build a relationship, build trust with them. Maybe you can build trust with an AI in 10 years' time, but I think advice will be there. I am excited by this idea of targeted support, because the reality is not everybody will be able to access financial advice or choose not to access, and I do hope that targeted support will go a long way to kind of stopping people from making stupid mistakes. But I think in itself will actually be a driver of people taking financial advice, because having gone through the process and realised that it's more complex than they thought, they might think, right, maybe I do need to go and get professional advice after all. So so good news for the advice industry. It's never quiet. There'll still be plenty to do over the next 10 years, but I think I'm certainly hoping to be working for the next 10 years supporting advisors.
Yeah, I mean, listening to you again and going through what we went through last time and being against the surveys, it's really interesting. I think you're right. Is that shift of people coming into retirement over the next 10 years away from kind of defined benefit schemes to more you're invested, and that has to change things. And it'd be interesting to see, I guess, that some people who are retiring now, it is better than they expected, maybe because they have got defined benefit schemes and all of that. So
yes, I do fear there is a generation of people who missed out on DB, missed out on auto enrollment, and it's going to be challenging for them. But that's really, the sooner we can get them planning and realising that they've got a challenge, then the better off they'll be.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you again for joining me, really, because it is fascinating, and I think where you've just said it, I think that's something that I think about a lot. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't worry about it, but I do worry about it. I worry about that group of people who don't realise how much they need to save. I think what you've done is kind of explained that it is complex and it's an evolving area, and your insights, I always find your insights really interesting. I think it's brilliant. So thank you very much. And anyone who's listening, you can go to BNY Investments on their website. There's information on retirement, and I'd recommend people to look at that. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please follow, share the podcast, and more content will be coming soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.